What if I told you that a single story, just one story, that shaped European economic policy for over a millennium, that kings, merchants, and peasants alike lived under a financial system built on ancient fear-mongering, and that when this system finally collapsed, it didn't happen because of enlightenment or progress, but because of greed so massive it couldn't be hidden anymore? This isn't about religion. This is about power, money, and a curse that became so embedded in Western civilization that breaking it nearly tore Europe apart. The curse has a name: usury, and for 1,000 years it was considered one of the gravest sins a one could commit, punishable by excommunication, public humiliation, and eternal damnation. But here's the twist that nobody talks about. The entire European economy depended on it. The Crusades? Financed by it. The Renaissance? Built on it. The discovery of the New World? Funded by it. So how did a biblical prohibition become the hidden engine of Western expansion? Why did religions spend centuries condemning the very practice that made them rich? And what finally broke the curse? Stay with me, because this story explains more about our modern financial system than any economics textbook ever could. Let's go back to the beginning. The year is 597 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king of Babylon, has just laid siege to Jerusalem. The city falls. The Temple of Solomon, the holiest site in Judaism, is destroyed. The Hebrew elite are dragged into captivity in Babylon, where they'll spend the next several decades as exiles in a foreign land. Among these exiles is a young man named Daniel, and it's here, in Babylon, that Daniel has a vision, a dream of 4 great beasts, and a prophecy about kingdoms that will rise and fall. The book of Daniel becomes part of the Hebrew Bible, and later the Christian Old Testament. But buried in the Torah in Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Leviticus are explicit commands about lending. You shall not charge interest to your brother. If you lend money to any of my people, you shall not be like a moneylender to him. You shall not charge him interest. This wasn't just financial advice. This was divine law. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When Christianity spreads across the Roman Empire and into medieval Europe, the Church Fathers take these Old Testament prohibitions and amplify them. St. Ambrose in the 4th century calls usury robbery. St. Jerome equates it with murder. By the Middle Ages, charging interest on a loan, any interest at all, is classified as a mortal sin. Pope Leo the Great, in 443 CE, declares usury the death of the soul. The Third Lateran Council in 1179 rules that usurers cannot receive Christian burial. The Council of Vienne in 1311 threatens anyone who defends usury with heresy charges. Think about that. For medieval Christians, lending money at interest wasn't just illegal or immoral, it was a pathway to hell itself. It was Nebuchadnezzar's curse, reborn, a prohibition that echoed the very captivity and suffering that gave birth to the law in the first place. But here's the paradox nobody could escape. Medieval Europe needed credit to function. Farms needed seed money. Merchants needed capital for trade expeditions. Kings needed loans to wage wars. Without credit, the economy would collapse. So how did medieval Europe solve this impossible problem? They didn't. Instead, they created one of the most hypocritical systems in human history. Let me show you how the curse actually worked in practice. Imagine you're a Christian merchant in 12th century France. You need 100 silver marks to buy wool from England, which you'll sell in Flanders for 150 marks. That's a solid 50% return if you can get the initial capital. But no Christian can legally lend you that money at interest. So what do? You find a Jewish moneylender. Here's the cruel genius of the system. Jews in medieval Europe were barred from most professions. They couldn't own land. They couldn't join guilds. They couldn't hold public office. But there was one profession the church allowed them precisely because Christians couldn't do it themselves: moneylending. The same religious text that forbade Christians from charging interest had a loophole. To a foreigner, you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest. Jewish scholars interpreted this to mean they could lend at interest to non-Jews. Christian theologians agreed reluctantly that Jews could do what Christians could not. So Jews became the financial intermediaries of Christendom. They provided the credit that made medieval commerce possible. They financed everything from agricultural cycles to royal wars. They were absolutely essential to the economy, and they were despised for it. This is where Nebuchadnezzar's curse reveals its true nature. It wasn't just a financial prohibition, it was a social weapon. Christians needed credit, but couldn't provide it without damning their souls. So they outsourced the sin to Jews, then blamed them for the very service they provided. When debts grew too large, when kings overspent, when merchants faced ruin, there was always a solution. Blame the Jews, accuse them of predatory lending, incite a pogrom, cancel the debts, seize their property, expel them from the kingdom. England did it in 1290. France did it in 1306. Spain did it in 1492. Over and over, across centuries, the pattern repeated. Invite Jewish lenders, use their capital, accumulate debt, then eliminate the creditors. The curse wasn't just about interest rates. It was about creating a permanent scapegoat class, a group of people who could be exploited economically and then destroyed politically whenever it became convenient. But here's what most people don't realize. Even as Jews were being persecuted, Christians were secretly engaging in usury themselves. They just called it something else. Let me introduce you to the most powerful financial institution in medieval Europe, one that technically didn't charge interest at all. The Knights Templar. Founded in 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, the Templars quickly evolved into something far more lucrative: medieval Europe's first international bank. They had fortified temples across Europe and the Holy Land. They had military might, and they had something revolutionary: a system of credit transfers. Here's how it worked. A French lord planning to join a crusade could deposit 1,000 livres at the temple in Paris, receive an encrypted letter of credit, then withdraw the equivalent amount in silver at the temple in Jerusalem. No physical gold crossed the Mediterranean. No bandits could rob the pilgrim. It was brilliant. But there's more. The Templars didn't just store money, they lent it. To kings, to merchants, to other nobles, and they absolutely charged for these services. They just didn't call it interest. They called it fees for management, compensation for risk, administrative costs. The church looked the other way because the Templars were fighting for Christendom. They were technically a religious order, and their financial services made the Crusades possible. This was the first crack in the curse. If the Templars could lend at interest by calling it something else, why couldn't others? By the 13th century, Italian merchant families, the Medici, the Peruzzi, the Bardi, had figured out even more creative workarounds. They developed dry exchange contracts. You'd give a banker 100 florins in Florence, and he'd promise to pay you 110 florins in London in 6 months. The 10 florin difference wasn't interest, it was compensation for currency exchange risk. Everyone knew what this really was, but the legal fiction protected both parties from church prosecution. The census contract was another loophole. You'd sell someone the annual revenue from your land for a lump sum, with the understanding that you could buy it back later. Again, not interest, just a sale. And then there was the societas, the medieval partnership. An investor would provide capital, a merchant would provide labor, and they'd split the profits. The investor's return wasn't interest, it was profit sharing. Medieval finance became an elaborate game of linguistic gymnastics. Everyone was lending at interest. Nobody was admitting it. But the biggest hypocrite of all? The church itself. The papacy was the wealthiest institution in Europe, and it needed constant cash flow to maintain its power, build cathedrals, and fund political machinations. So the church developed its own banking systems, partnering with Italian merchant houses to move money across Europe. Papal banking was usury, dressed in ecclesiastical robes. By the 14th century, The entire European economy was running on credit that everyone pretended wasn't interest-bearing. The curse was still technically in force. Usury was still a mortal sin, but the reality was that Christendom had built its prosperity on the very practice it condemned. This couldn't last, and it didn't. Friday, the 13th of October, 1307. At dawn, across France, royal soldiers simultaneously raid every Templar stronghold. Hundreds of knights are arrested. Their assets are seized. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debt to the Templars, has decided to solve his financial crisis the medieval way: destroy the creditor. The charges? Heresy, idol worship, desecration. But everyone knew the real reason. Philip owed the Templars a fortune. By destroying the order, he could cancel his debts and seize their wealth in one stroke. The Pope, Clement V, who was practically Philip's puppet, formally dissolved the Templars in 1312. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned at the stake in 1314. According to legend, as the flames consumed him, de Molay cursed both Philip and Clement. Both men died within the year. The destruction of the Templars sent a message. No creditor was safe, no matter how powerful. But it also revealed something crucial. The curse had become untenable. Europe's economy had outgrown medieval usury laws. The 14th century was a cascade of financial disasters. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks collapsed in the 1340s after England's King Edward III defaulted on massive war loans. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population, destroying labor markets and credit networks. The 100 Years' War drained royal treasuries. Everywhere, kings borrowed and defaulted, borrowed and defaulted. The curse wasn't protecting anyone anymore, it was strangling economic development. But the cracks really started showing during the Renaissance. Medici bankers in Florence were financing artistic masterpieces, scientific discoveries, and political dynasties. Their returns on capital were enormous. How could this be sin? How could financing Michelangelo's David or Brunelleschi's Dome be morally equivalent to murder? Then came the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, challenging papal authority. Among his many theological disputes was this: why should Christians follow medieval interpretations of ancient law when Scripture itself could be read differently? John Calvin went further. In his 1545 letter on usury, Calvin argued that the Old Testament prohibition applied to charitable loans to the poor, not commercial loans between merchants. Charging moderate interest for business purposes wasn't sinful, it was practical. Calvin's Geneva became a center of Protestant banking. This was the theological earthquake that shattered Nebuchadnezzar's curse. Once Protestants declared that moderate interest was acceptable, Catholic kingdoms couldn't compete economically while maintaining the old prohibition. They'd be outflanked financially. By 1600, even Catholic authorities were softening their stance. They wouldn't formally abolish usury laws that would take centuries more, but they stopped enforcing them rigorously. The legal fictions became accepted practice. The curse was broken, not by moral enlightenment, but by economic necessity. So what happened when Europe finally abandoned the usury prohibition? The world changed faster than anyone could have imagined. The Dutch Republic, Protestant, mercantile, and fiercely capitalist, pioneered modern finance. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609, created a stable currency system. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602, invented shares of publicly traded companies. The Dutch East India Company became the world's first mega-corporation, raising capital from thousands of investors who expected returns interest by any other name. Dutch merchants financed global trade networks, bringing spices from Indonesia, sugar from Brazil, slaves from Africa, and furs from North America. The returns were staggering. Amsterdam became the richest city in the world. England followed suit. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, explicitly lent money to the government at interest. The national debt became a permanent institution. Instead of kings defaulting on loans, the government issued bonds, promises to pay interest indefinitely. Investors bought government debt as reliably profitable assets. This was revolutionary. Nebuchadnezzar's curse had held that lending at interest was parasitic, extractive, immoral. But the new Protestant capitalist model said credit is productive. It finances ships, factories, infrastructure. Interest isn't theft, it's the price of time and risk. The Industrial Revolution would have been impossible under the old usury laws. Steam engines, textile mills, railways all required massive upfront capital with uncertain returns years later. Only a credit-based economy could finance that scale of investment. But here's the dark side. The same financial liberation that built factories and railways also financed the Atlantic slave trade and colonial exploitation on an unprecedented scale. The Dutch, English, French, and Spanish empires all ran on credit. Slave plantations were investment vehicles. Human beings were collateral. When we broke Nebuchadnezzar's curse, we didn't eliminate exploitation, we industrialized it. And the scapegoating didn't end either. Even as Christian Europe embraced capitalism, anti-Semitism persisted. The Rothschild banking family in the 19th century became targets of conspiracy theories, wealthy Jews controlling finance, even though Christian bankers like J.P. Morgan and the Warburgs were equally powerful. The curse's legacy lived on. Capitalism was now acceptable, but Jews were still blamed for its excesses. Now here's where this medieval story becomes urgently relevant. We live in the most debt-dependent civilization in human history. Global debt, government, corporate, household, exceeded $307 trillion in 2023. That's 336% of global GDP. The entire world economy is leveraged beyond anything medieval minds could have conceived. And yet, we still have the moral language of the curse. Listen to how people talk about debt today. Predatory lending, debt slavery, usurious rates. Credit card companies charging 24% APR are called vampires. Payday lenders are vultures. Student loan debt is a trap. We've inherited the moral framework of Nebuchadnezzar's curse, even though our entire economy runs on credit. Here's the parallel. Just like medieval Europe, we need credit to function, but morally condemn those who provide it. Just like medieval Europe, we create scapegoats, sometimes payday lenders, sometimes big banks, sometimes entire countries like China holding U.S. debt. And just like medieval Europe, we have elaborate fictions to hide what we're doing. The Federal Reserve doesn't print money, it conducts quantitative easing. Governments don't default, they restructure debt. Corporations don't pay excessive interest, they optimize capital structure. Same game, different language. But there's a deeper pattern. The cycle of boom, debt, crisis, and blame. Medieval kings borrowed, defaulted, and expelled creditors. Modern economies borrow, bubble, crash, and blame bankers. 2008 wasn't an anomaly. It was the latest iteration of a 1,000-year pattern. Subprime mortgages were just the 21st century version of over-leveraged medieval merchants. Credit default swaps were the modern equivalents of medieval dry exchange contracts, complex instruments designed to hide risk. And when it all collapsed, the same scapegoating, greedy bankers, Wall Street. Some banks failed. Most were bailed out. A few executives faced consequences. Most walked away rich. The debt remained. Here's the statistic that should terrify you. U.S. national debt is now over $36 trillion. The interest payments alone, just the interest, not the principal cost, over $1 trillion annually. That's more than the defense budget. We're paying interest on interest on interest in an infinite regress that mirrors the worst fears of medieval theologians. Nebuchadnezzar's curse warned against this exact scenario, debt that compounds until it enslaves. We broke the curse theologically, but we're living out its economic prophecy. And there's one more chilling parallel: the role of expelled creditors. Medieval Europe periodically reset its economy by destroying creditor classes: Jews, Templars, Italian bankers. We don't do that anymore. Or do we? When the Soviet Union collapsed, it defaulted on all debts. When Argentina faced crisis in 2001, it defaulted. When Greece nearly left the Eurozone, default was on the table. Defaulting is just modern expulsion, eliminating creditors without violence. Some economists now argue that periodic debt jubilees, the biblical practice of canceling all debts every 49 years, might be necessary for capitalism to survive. We've come full circle, back to the ancient Near Eastern practice that inspired the curse in the first place. The question isn't whether we'll face another debt crisis. The question is what we'll do when it comes. Will we scapegoat, reset, or finally learn the lesson that 1,000 years of history has been trying to teach us? Let's bring this home with 3 takeaways. First, moral frameworks and economic reality are often in direct conflict. Medieval Europe condemned usury while depending on it. We condemn predatory lending while living on credit cards. When your moral code makes your economy impossible, something has to give, usually honesty. Second, scapegoating is a feature, not a bug. Whether it's medieval Jews, 14th century Templars, or 21st century bankers, we create creditor classes, use them, then blame them when debt becomes unbearable. The curse's real legacy isn't the usury prohibition, it's the cycle of dependence and resentment. Third, debt always compounds. Whether it's Philip IV owing the Templars or America owing trillions, the mathematics are unforgiving. Interest on interest on interest will eventually break any system that can't grow faster than its debt. The medieval world solved this through periodic defaults and expulsions. We've tried to solve it through perpetual growth. But what happens when growth stops? Here's the warning. Nebuchadnezzar's curse wasn't really about interest rates. It was about power, who controls capital, who bears risk, and what happens when the system fails. We broke the theological curse, but we've built a financial system that operates on the same unstable foundation: ever-increasing debt, scapegoat creditors, and the promise that this time will be different. History suggests it won't be. So here's my question for you. Knowing what you know now about 1,000 years of financial history, do you think our current debt-based system is fundamentally different? Or are we just waiting for the next reset? If this story made you rethink how money, debt, and power actually work, do me a favor. Share this video. Not because I need the algorithm boost, though I won't lie, it helps, but because these patterns keep repeating precisely because people don't know the history. Understanding Nebuchadnezzar's curse won't solve the debt crisis, but it might help you see through the fictions we tell ourselves about how our economy works. And if you want to go deeper, I've got a whole series on how ancient financial systems shape the modern world. The next one is about how the Medici family invented modern banking while everyone thought they were just art patrons. You'll never look at the Renaissance the same way. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me what historical financial crisis you want me to cover next. And remember, every economic system in history has eventually failed. Ours won't be different. We're just living in the chapter before the reset. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Occult Europe. Now go forth and question every financial truth you've ever been told.